What's going on, everybody? It's firrrreeeeeee coming at you with a brand new video, and as of today of this video going up, the Fire King structure deck is officially releasing throughout all stores where cards are sold, and I could not be more excited. Konami did a really great job at basically reviving this kind of old, almost forgotten archetype in its structure deck reloaded series. These cards are incredibly powerful and potentially even have some tier 1, well, potential, especially when utilized with stuff like the Bellstar and Snake Eyes engine, but those engines, especially now after this deck has actually gotten some traction, have gotten pretty expensive, not to mention the uses for Bellstar with things like the currently popular Rescue Ace. There's just a lot of money dumping into a deck like that, especially one that isn't going to be seen as super good until February with the release of Phantom Nightmare. However, that isn't the only strong way to play the Fire King strategy. The deck, even on its own, is already pretty solid, and you can totally check out a budget $30 3 structure deck profile that I have on my channel. Link will be up in the top right and in the description down below if you want to check that out, especially if you are more inexperienced on what the Fire King cards do and you want a breakdown of what the new support entails. But my personal favorite way to play the archetype has to be the Tri-Brigade version, and that is what I'm going to be showcasing to you guys today. As a bird up player, it was definitely weird utilizing the Tri-Brigade cards for other combos since I hadn't really experimented with other Tri-Brigade variants since Sprite Elf was around, and so I've been having a lot of fun messing around with the deck, and I cannot wait to showcase my build. With that being said, let's go ahead and get right into my Fire King Tri-Brigade deck profile for the December 2023 format. Starting us off with the main deck and the Fire King engine, we have 3 copies of Legendary Fire King Ponix, 3 copies of Sacred Fire King Garunix, 3 copies of Fire King High Avatar Kirin. These are just the high levels and the important level 1. I'll showcase the other ones in just a moment. So I basically just wanted to max out on all 3 of these because all of them are just incredibly strong. Ponix, of course, being one of your main starters in the deck, but you actually can extend with it as a special summon if you pop something like your Tri-Brigade Kitt. Sacred Fire King Garunix is one of the best cards to actually open, alongside Kirin, because Kirin is a really powerful hand trap. Like, there's just so many different uses that you can have for these cards. I really like using Sacred Fire King Garunix as discard fodder for Karis because his effect is still live engraved, and Kirin can be used to pop your Fractal in your kit to act as, like, basically an Imperm stopper, because Imperm on your Tri-Brigades is really varf, but in this build, compared to, like, Bird Up, instead of summoning things like Nerval and Karis a lot, you're summoning Fractal and Kit a lot, which is really great because you can just use the Kirin to pop, dodge Imperm, and still get your summon. And for the rest of the Fire Kings, we have 2 Fire King Avatar Barong, 1 Fire King Avatar Rungbali, and 1 Fire King Avatar Arvada. I think this is a perfectly fine ratio of the level 4s. Barong at 2 is pretty solid because you don't really want to open it like all the time because you'd rather pop it from deck with things like your Garunix, but opening it, you can at least use it to pop off Fire King Island and stuff. Arvada is really good at dodging things like Nibiru or anything else, and I use the Graveyard effect all the time by going into Garunix on the opponent's turn and popping it to get access to the Barong back from the graveyard and then pop it off Garunix Eternity, stuff like that. The Rungbali is easily like one of the most cuttable cards in the deck, much less the Fire King engine. It is at 41 cards, so you can easily cut it if you want to. Like I said, a lot of this is kind of experimental, but having the spell Entrap Negate in a Tri-Brigade variant that otherwise does not have access to things like Herald of the Arclight can end up being pretty solid, and it's a really good extender to go into things like Abyss Dweller for the matchups that might need it, and you can very easily get access to it by just Fire King Island, popping your Ponix, adding it to hand, and then trigger a special summon. Sorry if things are a bit too fast in the way I explain them. As I mentioned, if you want more of an explanation on what the new Fire King cards do, or just what the Fire King cards in general do as a whole, then definitely check out the triple structure deck profile. I'm mostly just explaining how the archetypes really work together and how the deck functions as opposed to like what each of the individual cards do. Moving on to the Tri-Brigades, we have 3 copies of Tri-Brigade Fractal, 3 copies of Tri-Brigade Kitt, 2 copies of Tri-Brigade Karis, and 2 copies of Nerval. So this was definitely a weird ratio. Like, I don't think I've seen a ratio of Tri-Brigades like this in one of my lists since, like, Tri-Sprite was at full power, because Kit being a level 2 was, like, one of the biggest things of the deck. But now, Kit being a fire is one of the biggest things for the deck. Like, really opening Kitt is so good, because you can do things like pop it off of Fire King Island, or even off of Kieran just to get the effect to trigger. Like, it functions really well with the deck. The 2 Karis is honestly fine, like, you can either give or take, like, having an extra copy. Like, I don't really think it's too necessary, but I do like to have the extra extension later on. And I'm kind of considering bumping Nerval to 3, because while it isn't bird up, for example, and you don't really need it for its stats or anything, it definitely does feel pretty damn nice to have the 3rd, especially when it comes to follow-up after you get stuff like your Karis impermed and stuff, and you have no real way to stop it. Now on to probably the most cuttable card in the deck, just something I kind of wanted to play with as an experiment and just to be kind of funny, is 1 copy of Blaster Dragon Ruler of Infernos. So this card is actually pretty solid in a deck like this. You can pitch things like your Kitt in order to trigger this effect, or pitch things like the Sacred Garunix, of course, to get it in graveyard and still use the effect later. Not to mention the summon effect is pretty decent as well, because you are going to be linking into a lot of different stuff, even before you use your Tri-Brigade effects to lock you, so it's really not that bad. It's also a very large body, but again, this is at 41 cards, and if you're looking for a card that you really want to cut to play an even 40, Blaster's probably the way to go. I just think it actually is pretty fun and kind of unique compared to some of the other builds. For the hand traps, I'm deciding to keep it simple, just with 3 copies of Ash and 3 copies of Imperm. Not too much to say here. Ash is actually really synergetic with the deck because you can pop it off like a Fire King Island and trigger your Garunix. I think that's really funny. And then Imperm, of course, being Imperm, is very solid on top of that. I don't think there's really any other hand traps that feel mandatory to main deck right now, but you can definitely benefit from a lot in the side deck because you can pop them off Fire King Island just to get rid of them whenever you really need to, in case you like draw them if you don't. Moving on to the back row, we had a lot of monsters in the deck, but we have 2 copies of Fire King Sanctuary and the 2 copies of Fire King Island to go along with it. Very similar to the structure deck profile, especially on top of the other ones that we are playing. But this is really all you need. It is nice to open it, but you want to see it sometimes, not all the time. Most of the time, you are going to be searching it off your Ponix anyway, and so you don't really need to open it, though it is a really nice extender in case you do, because say you don't open Ponix, but you open like Fire King Island and an Ash Blossom, you can use the Fire King Island to pop the Ash Blossom, add the Ponix, and get a special summon to start popping off without having to like resort to normal summoning the Ponix later. And of course, Sanctuary being able to let you go into Hyung on the opponent's turn is so good. And as I mentioned, similarly to the structure deck, we are playing the 1 Circle and the 1 Skyburn. I think this is really all you need. They're just extra targets you can search off Ponix if you already have access to Sanctuary or Island. Really good cards overall. I mean, Circle of the Fire Kings especially. One of my favorite plays I've done in a test hand is I've linked a Kitt into Almirage and then used the Almirage as fodder for Circle of the Fire Kings to summon back the Kitt, who now had enough targets in graveyard for her effect because she dumped the Nerval. And then Skyburn is mostly kind of like a card that you want to get for board breaking later on because you'll have access to all your Fire Kings on turn 3 most of the time, or if you really end up in a bad situation going first, you can at least set this and get a couple of pops, plus when you pop the Eternity it can float into other bodies, and so you're not really negging at all. We're also on 3 copies of Fire Formation Tenki because not only is it a classic Fractal Searcher, but you can search basically any of the Beast Warriors you want. You can search for an Arvada in case you need a Monster Negate for an Nibiru, you can search Rungbali for that extra level 4 extender to go into Abyss Dweller, and you can even search Barong if you really feel like it, if you want to like pop it off a Fire King Island or something, so that you can have the search for like a Kieran during the standby phase. Finally, we just have the single Called by the Grave to wrap up the spells. Not too much to say here. I mean, it's mostly just there to stop things like Ash. You have Kieran to stop things like Imperm as well, but Called by is of course Called by. And to just wrap up the deck in general, we also of course have the 1 Tri-Brigade Revolt. Had to go with the 25th anniversary. So happy it got a super high rarity. But Revolt's going to be a main part of your end board. It does suck when you search off Bearfrom that it locks you, but you're doing a lot of Fire King summons on your opponent's turn actually, between your Kieran, your Garunix Eternity, stuff like that, so you actually don't really mind too much. It's really nice being able to play on your opponent's turn as well as your own. Moving on to the extra deck, it's a really interesting extra deck compared to a lot of my Tri-Brigade variants that I've made before, because you actually have flex spots in toolbox space. Starting, of course, with the Salamangreat Almirage. As I mentioned, this card's actually really synergetic with the deck. Instead of just using it as like a last-ditch effort when you normal a Nerval or a Kitt, you can actually use this with cards like Circle of the Fire Kings or Fire King Island. For example, if you open like Nerval and Island, instead of just getting the search off a Nerval, you can normal the Nerval, summon it into into an Almirage and then pop the Almirage instead to not only get the Nerval Search already, but also trigger things like Garunix or Ponix. Really, really good there. We also have, of course, the one firrrreeeeee and the one Bearbrum, very standard main parts of your combos. Bearbrum, especially getting the special summons for your fires back, is pretty cool, and being a fire herself, I think that's something that's not really touched on enough, because you can just pop this with something like Island or Kirin and search for your Revolt on top of setting up your things like your Fire King Island plays. We also have the one double Dragon Lords, very good target in the extra deck in general. It can be an end board piece, but most of the time you can use it going turn 3 or going second to break apart boards. We also have one copy of Hida, so this is definitely really good in combination with cards like SP, and it's a really good card in general when your main decks you're facing off against are like Rescue Ace, which is all fire, and then you have like Unchained, has cards like Sharvara that you can summon back, and you can just easily link climb into other cards. We're also on the 1 IP Masquerena, and this is where I would put my SP Little Knight.
If I had one!
Jokes aside, I just really couldn't be bothered to pick up a Little Knight, especially not for the price it's still currently going for. I currently am playing Nightmare Unicorn in its place, and it does similar things, and it's going to be the main thing that I summon off the IP Masquerena, but if you have access to Little Knight, which isn't out of the question because this is a pretty budget-friendly variant of the deck compared to like the Diabellstar engine, absolutely play Little Knight in this space. There are so many situations, especially by utilizing the Tri-Brigade cards. For example, you can go like Kit, Banish 2, summon a Bearbrum, and then just link off into SP Little Knight and trigger the effect of Search Revolt. So many little situations like that that don't seem super crazy, but actually just really, really are. It just makes the card so worth it in this deck compared to Unicorn, but if you are balling on a bit more of a budget like me, then Unicorn does get the job done for the most part. We are on 2 copies of Tri-Brigade Shurig, one for the combos and stuff, and then the other for the Revolt. Finally, to wrap up the Link monsters, we have the 1 Appaloosa and the 1 Access Code. Very standard for most Tri-Brigade variants. Funnily enough, we aren't playing the Hrsvelgr for the Access Code, so you kind of need a bit more than just the 1 card for the Access Code. But honestly, that's usually fine. You're gonna have a lot of resources engraved, so if you need to, you can go for like a Shurig or whatever for the big body and the Banish instead. Or if you really need to, you can just use one of your Fire King monsters. You could also just Banish 2 to get a double Dragon Lord's bounce. And you're playing a lot of very large Fire King monsters in general, so you're gonna usually already have the big bodies on board. Like if you're going for a lot of the combos, you can end on like the Garunix Eternity after blowing everything up, get all your Fire King recursion, and then like normal summon a Fractal or something, Banish 4, summon Shurig, and like you have Tenki on board, that's already game, right? TLDR, Access Code is a very nice card as always, but you can't make it as easily as you can a variant like Bird Up, and you don't really need it though is the big thing, so it's just kind of nice to have. Moving on to the Xyz monsters, of course we are playing the 1 Garunix Eternity. This card is just so good. What an amazing boss monster to give to an archetype. Nuking all monsters on summon, getting back row popping as well to break apart boards that aren't just monster focused, or in case people set a bunch of stuff after getting their board nuked on their turn. And then also floating if it's destroyed by any means is a very underlooked aspect of the card, especially because you can just pop it with a Fire King Island and get 2 bodies for the price of 1. Makes OTKing super easy, and you can trigger things like your Garunix as well, and even summon back cards like Arvada to get a monster negate in case you want to play it safe. A little bit of a flex spot, like I mentioned earlier, is the Abyss Dweller. Very good against certain matchups like Unchained and stuff. It's not like super mandatory, it's definitely very cuttable if you want to play something else in its place, but I think it does have its uses, and you can make it a decent amount of times because you can use cards like Rongbali. We are playing a couple of Xyz monsters in here, so of course we do want to play at least 1 copy of Divine Arsenal Zeus. Very good card for board wipes, and a lot of the time, even if you pop a back row using Garunix Eternity, you can just easily turn that into a Zeus to get yet another board wipe out of it. Very, very funny. And to complement the Zeus, we're also playing a Superstar Slayer Typhon Sky Crisis. I really love Typhon as a card, and in this deck in particular, as I mentioned earlier, you can make a lot of your Fire King plays on your opponent's turn. So even if you do something like normal Aponic, search for a card, and then make Typhon, you can at least go for some plays on the opponent's turn using your Fire King resources that you have, so you don't have to worry too much about playing on your own turn. And that is going to do it for my deck profile for the Fire King Tri-Brigade build. So excited to get more experience with this deck. As I might mention in a few points in the video, it's kind of experimental a little bit, but I am absolutely willing to grow and change the build as time goes on, and I find out what exactly perfectly fits for a specific format and like the way the cards interact with each other. And if you guys want to see a specific combo tutorial video, I have a couple different combos I've cooked up with this deck, then get this video to 50 likes. I don't think it's a super high goal, and I will upload a combo combo video as soon as possible. But until then, if you liked the video, please be sure to leave a like, as I'll split this video and the channel into 2 recommended, and if this content you're more like it, like the rest of my deck profiles. Again, be sure to check out the triple structure deck profile as well if you want a more in-depth breakdown on the cards. Then perhaps consider subscribing and turning on notifications because it supports the channel more than anything else, and it's absolutely free. Also, you want to support me directly while getting some awesome TCG merchandise in the process, check out Tapio cards in the link down below, use code Aurora5 for 5% off your purchase at checkout, and to support me financially. Once again, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. This is Aurora, signing off.